Many people worked here, were treated here.
Over the course of 15 years, from the time the VA began to shut down until now, we've lost 1,000 people out of the community of Knoxville. That's a significant piece of our town.
There's a scab that people are picking up. What they remember isn't what it once was.
We come before you today on this humble ground. It's ground that many of our wonderful veterans have passed through.
Knoxville, Iowa. The town of around 7,000 has its claims to fame. It's the birthplace of the Iowa state flag. Home of the sprint car capital of the world, the Knoxville Raceway. Final resting place of Iowa's 6th governor, William Milo Stone. But for decades it was also a respite for America's warriors, those soldiers whose wounds could not be seen.
My ancestor, J. Hugh Jones, homesteaded the land in 1841, and the family stories that I've heard is that he donated this land to the veterans. And he's a fur trader with American Fur Trading Company, traded furs with Indians and for 2 years prior to moving to Knoxville area in 1841.
The Knoxville Veterans Hospital was the site of several pioneering mental health treatments while providing the quiet, caring atmosphere those who carried the scars of war needed during their recovery.
From a professional standpoint, as a police officer, it was important. It was good for the community to have the veterans here because we were a small community. They felt welcomed here. And if there was a problem with an individual, I knew who, and others, other policemen, who the social workers were, or in my case, psychologists, because that's where Connie worked. And we knew if someone needed assistance and we weren't qualified to do it, give them a call and they would come out right away. And they're not going to get that in Des Moines.
But in its heyday, I mean, you're talking about a small city, a thriving small city. With all of the veterans that they assisted through the course of the time of the VA, extending many decades back, plus all of the workers, the doctors, and their families who attended school here in Knoxville, who contributed to other communities in Marion County.
That was until the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs opted to restructure the way it cared for those fighters. The inpatient hospital was closed in favor of more community clinics. Today, the only things that stand as any reminder of the hospital's past are the water tower, which bears the VA logo, and a modern laundry facility that has been idle for years. In the hearts and minds of Knoxville, the memories of the hospital will live on. Everyone has a story about the Knoxville VA. I worked there. My uncle was a patient there. I remember visiting that place on a field trip, and so on. This is the story of how a facility synonymous with Knoxville has undergone a transition to acres of possibility, ground fertile for the planting of the next chapter in a community that has lost part of its identity, a legacy in transition. Thanks to the work of the late Elaine Brewster and her team of researchers, we know the history of the land. Her husband, Stacy Brewster, provided photos and that text to help us add to it. The site first became a place for providing care as the State Industrial Home for the Blind. It opened January 1st, 1892, before closing April 30th, 1900. In what foreshadowed the years of rehabilitation offered, the residents of the home made brooms. An average of 550 brooms were made each month by 100 people. Even at this early time in the property's history, local residents benefited from welcoming patients. Marion County farmers grew broom corn to support the broom industry. After the last patient left the facility, it remained vacant for 2 years before it was reopened as the state hospital for inebriates. Governor Cummings approved the act that repurposed the site for the detention and treatment of all male persons addicted to the excess use of morphine, cocaine, or other narcotic drugs. The State Hospital for the Inebriates was unsuccessful in rehabilitating those it was intended to treat. The facility was unpopular with local residents. Escape attempts were made through neighboring timber and fields. Those who were most unmanageable were met with cruel treatment. Meals consisting of bread and water, having a wood block tied to their legs and being forced to drag it around everywhere they went. All of these unsavory acts and poor public perception led to the home's closure just a few years in. By June 1920, the United States was in need of more beds for its World War I wounded veterans. Colonel Barlow of the U.S. Public Health Service was commissioned to investigate the idle state-owned home in Knoxville. On August 21, 1920, 125 disabled veterans were brought to Knoxville. In June 1922, the federal government purchased the Knoxville site for $200,000. In the years that followed, the Knoxville VA bid for growth and expansion. Construction was strong in 1923. By 1933, the number of beds and tunnels had increased significantly. Patients grew their own vegetables on the land, and that year, an underground vegetable tunnel was constructed. The last patient buildings were completed in 1944. 1 year later, the hospital's capacity was 1,631. As the years passed, and America's fighters were sent around the world in the name of freedom, those who returned in need of care came to Knoxville. Upon their arrival and integration into Knoxville, they were welcomed into the community. Locals respected their service and their needs. At one point, the VA possessed 345 acres of land. Over the years, land was sold to other entities, including Marion County for a new park, and the Knoxville School District for new buildings. The Department of Veterans Affairs continued to grow nationwide. The Government Accountability Office was asked to examine the best practices for helping veterans into the future. Buildings were not only aging in Knoxville, but elsewhere. The recommendation was to shift the focus of the VA from inpatient services to community outpatient clinics.
It was a wrong-handed decision by bureaucrats in Washington and Des Moines and around.
Knoxville fought the closure of its inpatient hospital for years. Even though America found itself in a new war following 9/11, which created thousands more heroes in need of care, the federal government was not swayed. As it became more apparent their protests were not working, Knoxville's leadership accepted the closure and began to focus on the next chapter.
We would meet sometimes twice a month and with VA officials. And I found it eye-opening. It was an experience. It was frustrating because it seemed as though the goalposts were always being moved, and they were. And I did go to Washington and visited with the then Secretary of Veterans Affairs, General Shinseki, and pretty much what he said is being done now. He said we could have had the campus, but we'd have to buy it.
Work was already underway to adapt to life in Knoxville without a VA hospital when the final inpatients were transferred to a new home in Des Moines. That was 2009. For the next decade, the majority of the buildings remained empty. The main building on the campus housed an ongoing outpatient clinic until the new facility was completed away from the primary campus. Throughout that time, a few continued to fight to save the structures which may have continued to stand, but were substantially rotting and crumbling on the inside. All Knoxville residents could do was drive by and gaze upon the rotting corpse of a once vibrant part of the community. Suggestions were made for the use of the buildings from nearly all sectors of the community. The VA itself awarded the right to lease the buildings for 99 years to a local businessman and an out-of-state partner. What that partnership would have to charge for subleases made the entire project cost prohibitive. Federal processes for the transfer of ownership are time-consuming. Federal representatives who visited Knoxville to find a path forward reported that there was no precedent within the VA for disposing of a property this scope and size. The closest process was that used for abandoned military bases. There were no viable options for any other federal agency to use the campus. All VA property in Knoxville was transferred to the General Services Agency for disposal. On January 15, 2020, Marion County took possession of the campus for $1. The county formed an agreement with the city of Knoxville to redevelop the land.
I think for the most part, people see it as a positive. I think everyone is about on the same page. Of course, you can't please everyone. We know that, but from the people that I've talked to, feel pretty much the same way I do. I mean, I hate to see them come down. They're beautiful buildings, and we know the history. So we have that tie to those buildings because we know what that meant to the community of Knoxville for so many years. On the other hand, we know the condition that they're in. We know that there's really no repurpose for them. There's no reuse. It's not economically feasible to go in and remodel all those buildings. And so it's needed. We have to do it. As hard as it is to see, I think it's something that has to happen in order for us to move on.
Marion County remained the owner of the property and borrowed $11 million to demolish the majority of the buildings. The city of Knoxville has been tasked to develop the land following demolition. The county to this point has not received any funding for the demolition from the federal or state governments, though assistance has been requested.
They were going to dispose of this property with or without our involvement. So we had to have a lot of discussions, and Brian and Aaron and myself met extensively to think about, well, what would happen if we didn't get involved? Because initially I was not in favor of Marion County becoming the purchaser, the financial backer of this project. There was just a lot of logistical things and financial things we'd have to go through.
A team effort. I began working on this about 7 years ago. Once I've been mayor for almost 8 years. It took me a little while to kind of get my feet wet, figure out where I was at in this position, but I knew right away this was important. I knew it was something that we had to look into, and that we had to figure out a way to make this a positive outcome for the community of Knoxville. So yeah, I've been at it for a long time, not just me, several people, the past city manager, our current city manager, the board of supervisors of Marion County, so many staff members. It's been a joint effort of all kinds of people, lots of hours, lots of head scratching, lots of brainstorming, lots of discussions, well worth it to get to this point.
Prior to the commencement of demolition, Knoxville was given the opportunity to say goodbye to the buildings that had meant so much to the community.
Everybody asked the question, why are we tearing down buildings and not remodeling buildings? Okay, so we just completed an asbestos/hazardous material study. The reason we did that was twofold. Number one, the Fed said that they took all the asbestos out of these buildings back in the 90s. That is not accurate. These buildings are full of asbestos, and obviously with the mold issues, anytime you button up a building in the Midwest where there's things like humidity and you don't have an HVAC system running, you end up with lots and lots of mold.
I think you answered a lot of questions that people had during that tour. So, according to the building, it was an excellent job.
I think everyone knows the story here for so many years. The unfortunate situation that this campus has been in, and the situation for Marion County and the city of Knoxville to partner together to find a solution to this campus. I think it's a great day, like I said, for both Marion County and the city of Knoxville.
One thing that I want to highlight about this, as Brian and I and Aaron worked to secure the VA site for us, is that we're doing this, all of us, as a county, as residents of Knoxville, residents of Marion County. We're getting no federal help. We tried and tried to get federal help, and none was forthcoming.
Vite Demolition was hired to tear down the buildings and recycle materials it pulled from the site. Marion County's facilities manager, Chris Nestaby, offered regular updates on the demolition's progress to the Board of Supervisors.
There's a lot of false walls out there, a lot of plaster over mesh that is 2 or 3 inches away from a foundation pillar, and they ran piping that has asbestos lining on it. The city of Knoxville is going to publish this, but the 18th, which is next Monday, West Pleasant Street will be closed for upwards of 5 days. Most everything on the north side is down. 74 is completely down at this point. We're pulling the debris up. You have the remainder of the fire station, which they're going to continue to utilize here for about the next month and a half. It gives them a great place to have meetings.
The county hired a firm named Confluence to create a concept for what is now known as the VA Redevelopment District. In the months after this documentary premieres, the land will be repopulated with housing, light shopping, and a new park. Getting through the demolition process was easier than expected. This is in spite of those performing the work encountering unexpected structures that had not been recorded in any of the property's official documents. More asbestos than was known. Additional tunnels that were not mapped. Wiring that was unaccounted for. Each step of the way, the demolition company adapted and overcame to officially end the demolition in July 2022. Footage of the actual demolition has been limited at the request of Vite. Practices and equipment are proprietary. Much appreciation has been and continues to be extended to the company for the cooperation and assistance in the making of this film. An uncertain future lies ahead for Knoxville and Marion County. Optimism around town has rebounded since the reminders of the past are gone and only open fields remain. The Knoxville VA may be gone, but it will never be forgotten. Not by the families of the thousands of veterans treated there, nor those who dedicated their lives to providing that care. Knoxville is not only in control of the legacy of the VA, but for the first time in over 100 years, it may also control its own destiny.